The story we have been told about the American Revolution is a lie. The elementary school account of a bunch of Americans in powdered wigs fighting a war against taxation without representation and against monarchy is, while not completely inaccurate, a misrepresentation of the events that occurred. In reality, the Founding Fathers, while certainly not united on the subject, much as they were rarely united on any subject, were vehemently opposed to the idea of mass democracy. This, however, doesn't mean that the Founding Fathers were, as frequently characterized by recent accounts of them, a bunch of rich, evil slaveholders who just wanted to protect their own wealth and keep the common man down. In fact, for many of them, the opposite was true. And in the great irony of history, it was the more democratic of them who did the most to perpetuate and extend slavery throughout the country, and it was the most elitist of them who sought to abolish it. So why then, if the Founding Fathers did not approve of mass democracy, did they enact and fight the War of Independence? In short, it was to abolish feudalism and free the middle classes from the restrictions set forth by the British monarchy and the landed aristocracy. It was not simply a desire to allow representation for the colonies in Parliament, but to assert and acknowledge the long-held belief that the colonies were not under the control of the British Empire. The colonies were granted their possessions in America, especially by the king himself, who allowed them the right of self-government, which was now being violated. The mission of the colonies of America, as John Adams put it, for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind all over the earth, was now being threatened by a combined force of king and parliament, which sought to restore them to the fold whereby their dreams of expansion and prosperity could be quashed. In the wake of this newfound independence, though, and indeed during the Revolutionary War itself, many of the American revolutionaries were disillusioned with the actions of their countrymen and their own democratic idealism. The members of the Continental Congress had frequently been bickering over sectional differences, stroking their own egos and refusing to cooperate with others. This in turn had severely hampered the war effort and prevented the Continental Army from receiving ammunition, clothing, and even food itself. Now, with independence for America won, things were hardly any better. The government under the Articles of Confederation was, in the words of George Washington, 13 sovereignties pulling against each other and all tugging at the federal head. Since the multiplicity of states held supreme power under the Articles, the federal government during the time before the Constitution could not levy taxes, leaving it woefully underfunded. It could not levy troops, leaving the government to rely on militia from the states, which often struggled to respond effectively to the demands of war. It could not regulate trade between the states, leading to conflicts and trade wars between the states themselves. Congress could not even force the states to obey the treaty obligations that had ended the war with Britain. On top of all of this, the issues occurring within the states' governments were perhaps even more dangerous. The Revolution, as Gordon Wood states in his book Empire of Liberty, had greatly democratized the state legislatures, both by increasing the number of their members and by broadening their electorates. These new legislatures, staffed by men from all strata of wealth, immediately began to enact legislation on behalf of special interest groups. Their electors now clamored for policies which would bring them commercial benefits. Farmers, artisans, entrepreneurs, merchants, and the representatives themselves all expected that members of the state legislatures would be voting in their interest. These various groups often had to engage in all too familiar political practices to get what they wanted for their constituents and themselves. As Gordon Wood says, everywhere the gentry leaders complained of popular legislative practices that today are taken for granted: log rolling, horse trading, and pork barreling that benefited special and local interest groups. This sort of political dealing was rampant. Its result was a chaos of lawmaking, resulting in an excessive glut of laws and legislation, and rewriting, revising, repealing, then enacting once more, laws which threatened various groups, then provided them satisfaction, then once more took away the legislation they wanted. Instead of voting for government officials for patriotism, virtue, or integrity, people cast their ballots for the sole reason of receiving some reward from their elected official. By the end of the 1780s, the revolutionary elite had become so dejected so as to question if the revolution itself was worthwhile. For his part, George Washington doubted whether the masses could be influenced by any other principles than those of interest. The inefficiency and democratic nature of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, and the brazen, self-interested character of the democratic state legislatures resulted in a shift in the mindsets of the revolutionary elite. Whereas before the patriots would have praised democracy as an inherent counterbalance to tyranny, they now began to believe that democracy itself was more than capable of producing tyranny. As Thomas Jefferson said, an elective despotism was not the government we fought for. How specifically, though, does this mass democracy produce such tyranny or such brazen selfishness? While many founding fathers chalked it up to the natural corruption of the human heart, And while others were perfectly content for most of the common folk to remain poor and ignorant, there were those who perhaps had more foresight to identify why exactly mass democracy is problematic. And in so doing, they provided a solution to it which preserves the republican form of government, and in many ways even foreshadows communist forms of government. The issue as they identified it was the ownership of property. Owning sufficient property meant you were independent of anyone to provide for you. You could work it with your own hands, or if you were wealthy, could hire or enslave someone else to do it for you. You did not need to get the bread you ate submissively from the hand of one above you. This in turn allowed you not to be blinded by greed in voting for legislation concerning the good of the country. You could vote yes or no without seriously being affected financially, and therefore you could see more clearly than someone who stood to gain financially by voting. Not owning property, however, made you subject to these desires for accumulating wealth, and thus you would be tempted to vote for those things which enriched yourself, even if it harmed the general welfare. Or even worse, you could unwittingly be the puppet of someone of wealth and power who used your votes to achieve their political end. As John Adams said, such is the frailty of the human heart that very few men who have no property have any judgment of their own. They talk and vote as they are directed by some man of property who has attached their minds to his interest. It may seem that this is self-serving propaganda that unrightfully makes the poor out to be stupid pawns. But when you consider the tendency for those on welfare to vote for the corrupt system that deliberately traps them in dependency to the government and regulates the very way they live their lives, or the way that the middle class votes enthusiastically for Republicans whose sole concern is reducing taxes for the wealthy and privatizing public goods, it seems much more likely that Mr. Adams is actually correct. And this is why most states required some form of property ownership to vote in early America. So then, if only those who own property are disinterested enough to participate in politics, why then should we have a government of, by, and for the people? If only those with property or a stake in the country should vote, why should we not just be, an oligarchy or an aristocracy? The answer to this question is that it is not necessary for property to be concentrated in the hands of a few. Indeed, in early America, the great majority of the free male population owned land enough to be eligible to vote. But those who did not own property naturally still wanted to participate in the political process. What then should be done to make sure that we can have a republican form of government, not just be ruled by the wealthy and landed, while at the same time prevent America from effectively being ruled by a mob who only care about their own interests? The solution, proposed by many founding fathers, was the distribution of land to all. Thomas Jefferson proposed in the state constitution of Virginia that every person of full age, neither owning nor having owned 50 acres of land, shall be entitled to an appropriation of 50 acres in full and absolute dominion. John Adams had perhaps a more succinct explanation. He said, "Power always follows property. Nay, I affirm that the balance of power in a society accompanies the balance of property in land. The only possible way then of preserving the balance of power on the side of equal liberty and public virtue is to make the acquisition of land easy to every member of society, so that the multitude may be possessed of landed estates. If the multitude is possessed of the balance of real estate, the multitude will have the balance of power, and will take care of the liberty, virtue, and interest of the multitude in all acts of government." The issue then with democracy is not that the common people are not good, or valuable, or deserving of expressing their voice in politics. The issue is rather that democracy, without the equal distribution of the country's wealth and power, gives them a voice in a process which is dominated by those with wealth and power, who can then steer them away from what is truly good for them by promising them meager rewards in the short term. People today vote for welfare and low taxes when they could have so much more, if they only realize that their vote is not as powerful as they believe it to be, and it is this that the Founding Fathers understood when they framed our laws. Today, not everyone would be a farmer, of course, but allotting every family a plot of land with a home to live in would be a comparable solution for modern society. Of course, more than just economic opportunity for all is required, as John Adams understood when he said that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. But this equal distribution of access to the country's wealth is a required step for achieving the true end of democracy: government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And people are not truly free to make decisions when their financial well-being is ignored by the economic structure of the nation, or when their very survival is at stake. It's a shame that the dreams of our forefathers, the dream of state-enforced mass land ownership, was never put into place. Over time, wealth and power began to concentrate into fewer and fewer hands in America. Our history was rewritten, and the masses, while achieving more and more political power since the Revolution, have only lost more and more of their relative economic power. And it's economic power that really counts.